Hey, Dr. Nerida here, horse lover, PhD equine nutritionist, and founder of My Happy Horse, the world's first virtual equine nutritionist. Today, on the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast, we are going to be talking about one of my favourite subjects, feeding Lucerne hay before you ride. To find out why it's so important to me and how much it is going to help your horse's health, welfare and behaviour, have a listen. Hey, welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. Dr. Nerida here, and I am super excited to be talking today about feeding Lucerne hay before you ride. Now, if you're from anywhere that calls Lucerne alfalfa, or if you're from somewhere that calls alfalfa Lucerne, I will use both words interchangeably to save me saying both at the same time. But essentially, they're one and the same thing. So if you hear me say Lucerne, I also mean alfalfa. If you hear me say alfalfa, I also mean Lucerne. Some of you might have heard me say before that if I had 2 minutes with every horse owner in the world, this is actually what I would teach them, to feed Lucerne hay before they ride. So let me give you a little bit of a backstory on this one. I grew up on a beef cattle farm in Australia, Tamworth, New South Wales, or close to Tamworth in New South Wales for anyone who knows Australian geography well. And we had no tracks on our property, so no roads, I should say. So we had, for a lot of it, it's quite steep, so we didn't have any vehicle access to most of the property, which meant that as kids we spent a lot of time on horses mustering cattle, which, you know, it was a dream childhood. I absolutely loved it, that we had to spend lots of time on horseback. But you know, my family really knew nothing about horses. So they'd had horses for a very long period of time. They'd even bred horses over the years, but they were there because they were an essential part of farming. My grandfather had been on that property for a very long time, so they had needed horses just to carry out sort of day-to-day operations on the farm, but we didn't know anything about horses. So I think back to, you know, those early days of me riding, my family having horses, and I think, oh my goodness, like the things we didn't know and the things that our horses would have unknowingly to us suffered through because we didn't know anything about their gastrointestinal physiology, anything about their correct nutrition. They essentially, they lived a good life. I mean, they had large paddocks and lots of pasture, but we really didn't know how to take proper care of them. And one of the things I think back to on a pretty frequent basis, my beautiful mare. So I still remember the morning I walked into the bathroom. It was early. My dad was getting ready. My dad was a shearer, so he was getting ready to go to work early. And I still remember I walked into the bathroom and he said to me, "I found you a horse." I was 8 at the time, and the horse that he'd found me was a weanling quarter horse that he paid $40 for because she was bred for racing and the man who bred her was no longer going to race horses. So he had these weanlings that he really just wanted to essentially get rid of. This was in the 80s. And so Dad bought me a weanling quarter horse, and bless her, she was the most incredible horse. I rode that mare until I was, into my 30s. So I had her from when I was 8 years old until we very sadly had to have her put to sleep when I was 35. So I had her for a long period of time. But, you know, I think back, we used to do days of mustering where we would have done 40 to 60 kilometres of riding in hill country. And I cannot remember whether we used to feed our horses hay at lunchtime or whether, if we could have let them out, I guess on pasture we would have. But I don't remember ever looking after their gastrointestinal health. And it makes me cringe now thinking about their stomachs and the risk of ulcers when you ride horses for such long periods of time in a day. So I have become very passionate in my professional career about teaching people to feed hay before they ride their horses, because from a welfare perspective and also a health perspective, it's so incredibly important that we keep their stomach full of fibre. So I always think of my little mare Coco when I talk about this topic, and I just think, oh my goodness, like I'm so terribly sorry for what I did to you because I didn't know. And I guess it's become one of my missions in life to help other horse owners now to understand how a horse's stomach works and why it's so important for us to keep their stomachs full of fibre so that we don't unknowingly cause gastric ulcers and in doing so cause massive amounts of pain. I think back to riding her and I see photos of her now too. She would often have her lips pulled back. I'm pretty sure she would have had gastric ulcers. She sort of often had her lips pulled back, often was chomping at the bit, was often quite anxious. And a lot of that would come down to, and if I could travel in time, I'd go back and have her scoped and see if I'm right. But knowing what I know now, I'm pretty sure that she had gastric ulceration, and I would do anything to go back and fix that. But of course I can't. So moving forward, I want to help everyone I can and all of their horses to not go through that same situation. And it's such a simple thing. Feed, loosen hay before you ride. So let's just recap a little bit of gastrointestinal physiology. Hopefully you may have heard the podcast number 2 where we go through some gastrointestinal physiology, but really the only part that I want to focus on today is the stomach. So the stomach of a horse, I always say if I could redesign the horse, this would be part of what I'd redesign. But of course, in redesigning it, I'd stuff something else up. So we probably best just stay with what we've got to work with and feed our horses in a way and manage our horses in a way that works with the physiology that they have. So the horse's stomach is similar to ours in that it's a single stomach and it's a gastric stomach. It releases gastric acid. But it's also very different to a human stomach for a few reasons. So the first reason is that a horse's stomach secretes gastric acid 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They do not have an on-off switch for gastric acid. Whereas our human stomachs, we switch acid production on when we start to eat and we switch it off again when we finish eating. So we're only releasing gastric acid when our body knows that food is coming. Because a horse evolved over 55 million years to be almost constantly eating, their stomach just didn't see the need for an on-off switch. So they secrete gastric acid into their stomach constantly, which when they're left to eat like a horse, graze like a horse, roam like a horse, and have very few periods of time where they're not actually eating forage and chewing, that's not an issue at all. Where it becomes an issue is for our modern day horses when we have them in stables and don't have access to pasture or other forage at any time they please, or when they're travelling over long distances, or when we're riding them like we used to as kids when they were like proper working stock horses and they were being ridden for, we would be on them for up to 10 hours a day when we were doing massive musters. They used to work so hard for us. Any of those periods of time, so performance horses, whenever they travel to an event and then they're at the event, they may not have ready access to forage. Any time a horse is not chewing is a time when their stomach is potentially emptying out but still secreting gastric acid. So that's the first thing you need to remember about the horse's stomach is this constant secretion of acid. The second really important thing we need to remember about their stomach is the bottom part of their stomach protects itself from the acid because that's where the acid is secreted, and it was smart enough to come up with a protective mechanism, so it secretes very thick mucus to protect itself from actually burning holes in itself with the acid that it secretes. But the top part of the stomach learnt to, over many millions of years, rely on it being full of fibre, essentially, so that the acid that was in the bottom of the stomach just physically couldn't splash up and touch the top part of the stomach. But of course, for our modern day horses, because they don't always have ready access to forage and there is periods of time when their stomach will empty out, the top part of their stomach does come into contact with the gastric acid where it was never designed to do that. So the top part of the stomach is really just skin. It's like the skin on the back of your hand, the lining of the top part of the stomach. So if acid splashes up there is no protection whatsoever. And the acid literally will burn holes through the top of the stomach, causing ulcers that we call squamous gastric ulcers. So the squamous region being the top region of the stomach and the squamous ulcers being the gastric ulcers that occur in the top part of the stomach. And the primary reason they occur is because we allow a horse's stomach to empty. And they, of course, have this 24/7 gastric acid secretion. So we get an empty stomach with acid still being secreted, and that acid will literally just splash up and burn holes through the top of your horse's stomach. So feeding alfalfa hay before you ride means that you can prevent those ulcers from occurring because we fill the stomach up with fibre. And really importantly, you will improve your horse's level of comfort while you're riding. So if you've got a horse that you're riding on an empty stomach and you've got acid splashing around and literally eating its way through the top part of the horse's stomach lining, it's a really uncomfortable situation for your horse. And your horse is unlikely to be able to concentrate on you, unlikely to be able to do everything you're asking of them, and really unlikely to be able to remain calm. So in feeding them Lucerne hay before you ride, you also support their ability to stay calm and to really focus on you and give you that lovely focused energy that we all love so much in our horses. Part of what I think stops horse owners, so you might be feeling at the moment going, oh, really? Really I should feed my horse Lucerne before I ride? You might be feeling a little bit, I guess, anxious about that, hesitant about that, really unsure about that, because it's such an unnatural thing for a human to want to eat before we go and do exercise. So my son's actually doing his cross country at school today, and I was looking at their schedule for when their race was on, and I said to him, just be careful how much you eat for recess. So they had their recess break right before he was going to run, and I said to him, be careful how much you eat at recess, because if you put a lot of food in your stomach, you'll get a stitch when you're running. And anyone who is a runner, or I remember distinctly as a kid running on a full stomach, you get this pain in your side, so you get a stitch. And it's a really uncomfortable thing to run as a human with a full stomach, and it never works. Well, at least for me, I run just a tiny bit, and I need to actually be quite strategic in when I eat, because I don't want to be hungry when I run, but I also don't want to have much food in my stomach, because I will almost always get a stitch if I eat too close to when I run. So we have our human wiring to tell us that having a full stomach is really uncomfortable for us if we're exercising. But you have to remember that we're a predator in the animal world. So we have that amazing luxury of being able to decide when we eat and also when we're going to go hunting, back when we were evolving. So we could choose when we wanted to be physically active in comparison to when we'd just eaten. But you think about the horse is a prey animal. So if there was some large predator stalking it and about to eat it, the horse couldn't say, whoa, hang on a minute, I've only just eaten. Could we hold off the chase for, half an hour or so? Let me digest a little bit of food, and then you're free to chase me as fast as you like for as long as you want. They couldn't do that. They just had to be able to run for their own lives at the drop of a hat. So if their stomach was full, they had to run with a full stomach. So they're actually designed to run with a full stomach, and it is uncomfortable for them to exercise on an empty stomach. So completely the opposite to us. And I find that a lot of people's hesitations around when I first suggest to them, feed Lucerne hay before you ride, a lot of their hesitation is that we know as a human that if we eat and go and fill our stomach up before we exercise, it's very uncomfortable. But you must remember that horses are precisely the opposite to a human in this regard, and it is comfortable for them to have a full stomach when you're exercising, and very uncomfortable for them to have an empty stomach when they're exercising. So let's just look really quickly at why feeding hay before you ride is such an effective tool in preventing squamous gastric ulcers, and I guess why it's a must, like why you always must feed Lucerne hay. I'll just say really quickly here, if you don't feed Lucerne or alfalfa hay for any reason, or you can't because in your part of the world it's not available, then any hay will do. So if you have a grassy hay or an oaten hay or a native meadow hay or any kind of hay, whatever hay you feed, if you give that to your horse while you are tacking up and getting ready to ride, then it will do most of what Lucerne hay will do, and we'll talk about that now. So the first function of hay before you ride is that it allows your horse to fill up their stomach, essentially, with fibre. And when the stomach's full of fibre, it provides a physical barrier so that the acid that's sitting in the bottom of the stomach literally just can't physically splash up and burn holes through the top part of the stomach. When I do this in front of an audience or when you're physically with me, what I'll normally do is get 2 plastic milk bottles, and I'll have one milk bottle just with a liquid in the bottom that I've put some sort of food colour, like a blue or a red food colour in, so that you can see the water. And in the other milk bottle, I'll have exactly the same amount of water with food colouring, but I will have stuffed that milk bottle full of lucerne chaff or chopped lucerne. And I'll show you that with the empty milk bottle, it takes very little movement. So there's some really cool research that was done many years ago now, but there was a pH meter that was put down a horse's esophagus, and it was sat right at the top of the stomach. So right where the esophagus, well, not quite at the top, but up in the top section of the stomach, right where the esophagus enters the stomach. They sat the pH meter there. And when horses had an empty stomach, what the researchers found is that when the horses were trotting, cantering, or galloping, the pH in that part of the stomach, which should not be affected by gastric acid, the pH dropped down to being really low, so indicating that the acid was indeed splashing up to that part of the stomach when the horse started trotting, cantering, or galloping. And I show you that with the milk bottle, so it doesn't take very much movement at all when that milk bottle is empty to just splash that liquid up to the top of the milk bottle. Whereas you get a milk bottle and you stuff it full of chaff and then try to splash it around. You can shake that milk bottle around as hard as you like, and you cannot get that liquid to splash up to the top part of the milk bottle because there's a physical barrier there. So the biggest role for the hay that you feed before you ride is to provide that physical barrier, to physically stop the acid from splashing up and affecting the top part of the stomach. The second function it has is that when horses chew hay, they salivate a lot. So they create a lot of saliva in their mouth, which is then swallowed with the hay. And it's litres per kilogram of hay that they eat, or per couple of pounds. They're producing litres of saliva. And that saliva has a very, very important role in that it actually buffers the acid in the stomach. So your horse's stomach pH, if you leave a horse for 4 to 6 hours without anything to chew on, there's really no saliva going into the stomach when they're not chewing on forage. And the pH in their stomach can drop to as low as pH of 1. So if you know the pH scale, it goes from a pH of 1, which is very, very acidic, up to a pH of 14, which is very alkaline. And their stomach, you would normally like to be 4 or higher. We don't like to see it spend too much time down below a pH of 4. But if you leave them for long periods of time without forage to chew on, so without hay or without pasture to chew on, the pH actually can drop down to a pH of 1, which is battery acid, essentially. That's the pH of battery acid. And if you go and Google search pH 1 fluids, you will see all these warnings about how corrosive they are and how you need to be very careful when handling them. And that's potentially what you have in your horse's stomach. So if you think about that, if your horse, say, has travelled to an event and has been travelling for 4 hours, and then you take that horse off the trailer and hop on and start riding without giving the horse an opportunity to eat some hay, then the pH in your horse's stomach could potentially be as low as 1. And then that liquid is splashing around and splashing up onto that top unprotected section of your horse's stomach and creating gastric ulceration, which is very painful. Unlikely you're going to do very well at that competition because your horse will be distracted by the fact that its stomach is so painful. So giving them hay before you ride creates a lot of saliva, and the saliva actually buffers the acid in their stomach. So instead of being a pH of 1, you'll have it up more around a pH of 4 or higher, which is much less, I want to use the technical term, burny. So I actually don't know what the correct technical term is, but if the pH is higher and the acid does happen to splash up and you do get some up on that top part of the stomach, it's much less acidic and therefore much less likely to burn holes through your horse's stomach lining and cause gastric ulceration. So that's the second function of feeding hay. So first is that it provides that physical barrier of fibre. The second is that it encourages a lot of saliva production to buffer the gastric acid that is in your horse's stomach so that it's less likely to burn holes through the top part of your horse's stomach. The third function, and this is specifically when you feed lucerne or alfalfa hay, is that the hay itself, so the lucerne hay itself is actually a natural buffer. So it's high in calcium, high in protein, and that combination of nutrients that lucerne contains actually also has the effect of raising the pH in your horse's stomach. So again, it brings up the pH and makes the gastric fluid even less likely to burn holes through your horse's stomach. So like I said, if you can't feed lucerne hay for any reason or you don't have access to it, then feeding any hay will still give you that fibre barrier effect, and it will also give you the saliva effect. You just won't get the natural buffering effect of the lucerne. But, 2 out of 3 is great. So whatever hay you have on hand, then you should feed that. So what a lot of people tell me, and I've literally had people come and stop me at horse shows and say, "Were you that person that taught us to feed lucerne hay before we ride?" And oh my goodness, the difference that it has made to their horse's behaviour or, to their horse's willingness to do whatever it is they're asking them to do is unbelievable. And I love those stories. And I know that it has such a big impact on your horse. So if you've got a horse, and particularly if you've got a horse that gets anxious when you ride, or gets grumpy when you ride, or is swishing, particularly look out for agitated tail swishing when you're riding. That's often, it's not always, but it is often a sign of gastric ulceration and of stomach discomfort in my experience. It takes all of that away for them. It suddenly makes their stomach so much more comfortable, and they're just happier horses. And when they're happier horses, they're going to do so much better for you. And it's also a much nicer experience. The energy of riding a horse when they're content and happy is so different to riding a horse that's, agitated and in pain. So even if you're a little bit hesitant to try this, I really encourage you to try it, because you will see, particularly if you've got a horse that you struggle with when you're riding from a behaviour perspective or an attitude perspective, just try it and you will see, I'm sure you will see the difference. People often ask, well, how much do I feed? And it's a really good question. What we normally do with our horses is that we'll just get a biscuit or a flake, depending on what you call a piece of lucerne hay, and put that down in front of them while we're saddling them up. And it depends how much time we're taking to saddle up. I find sometimes we dawdle around if we've got time and spend a lot more time, brushing and doing tails and manes and waiting for other people if they're saddling up with us. So they might eat the entire flake. So that's around 2 kilos, or they might eat about half of it. But my horses are all coming off pasture all the time. So even when horses are coming off pasture, I would still encourage you to feed alfalfa hay before you ride them. So my horses get a 2 kilo approximately piece of lucerne, and they may eat all of it. They may eat about half of it. So if your horse hasn't had anything to eat for a couple of hours before, so say if your horse is stabled or kept in a barn and you get to the barn to ride and your horse hasn't had any hay in front of it for the last couple of hours, which is fine, make sure that they get the time to eat about 2 kilos of hay, or around 4.4 pounds of hay, before you hop on and ride them. So give them enough time to eat that much so that you get enough of a fibre barrier and enough saliva in their stomach to have a positive impact. If the horses are like mine, like I just said, coming off pasture, then a kilo is enough. About 2.2 pounds is enough to get enough fibre, because they should already have a stomach that's reasonably full of fibre, having constant access to pasture. So you can get away with a little bit less when they're out on pasture. If they haven't finished all their hay, what I love with our horses is that when we come back, there's almost always some lucerne hay left where we tack them up, and we'll come back there once we've finished riding. And I love that after they've been ridden, So remember, their stomach is secreting gastric acid the whole time you're riding them, because that never ever switches off in a horse. But I love that for our horses, they can come back and put their heads down and eat some more lucerne after their ride, because again, you're immediately getting more fibre into their stomach, more saliva into their stomach. And if there was any acid splashed during a ride, then you're washing, I sort of see it in my mind as washing it off the walls of the stomach, with the fibre and the saliva that they're eating after the ride. So I actually really love feeding lucerne before you ride, and also allowing them to have some lucerne immediately after your ride. And there's another really cool benefit. Actually, there's a couple of other cool benefits to doing this. One of them is that when you can get protein into your horse's system when you're actually riding, and particularly lucerne protein or alfalfa protein, it's quite a high quality protein, and it's got a lot of really lovely essential amino acids in it. So you'll actually support muscle building while riding, which is an awesome thing if you've got a horse that you would like to build some muscle on. And the other function that it plays for me with our horses don't do a lot most of the time. So there's maybe one or two that are competing at any one time, and the others are just not doing a whole lot. We'll ride them here and there, but even for the ones that we have in work, the work's not hard. It's usually light to moderate work. And I find that with our good doers, and particularly our good doers who live in a track, giving them that lucerne on the day that they ride is enough of an energy and protein increase to cover their requirements, their additional energy and protein requirements for the days that they're ridden. So that's not always going to be the case, of course, if you've got a horse in really hard work, and a lot of horses will already be on lucerne, but our horses get a much smaller amount of lucerne with their feed every day, and then on the days that they're ridden, they get an additional amount. And I find that it's just enough for our good doers. So predominantly, actually we've got lots of breeds now, but stock horse, quarter horse, paints, thoroughbred. For the good doers, so the stock horses, quarter horses and paints, it just seems to be enough to have them maintain their muscle mass and have them maintain their body weight, because they're getting that extra protein and calorie on the days they're ridden, because we're always giving them lucerne before we ride. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So if you listen to the very first podcast, I talk about feeding a horse like a horse and really honouring our horses' 55 million years of evolution. So we've domesticated these horses, just over 4,000 years ago, which is less than 0.01% of their time that they've been on Earth. So we're working with a gastrointestinal tract that has been set in stone for a very, very long period of time. And as horse owners, we really need to be conscious of the way that gastrointestinal tract functions, and feeding and managing our horses in a way that honours that physiology and does the best we can do to stop what we're doing with our horses from causing major problems like gastric ulceration. And honestly, feeding lucerne before you ride is one of the simplest and most effective management things you can do with your horse. And the thing that I really love about it is our horses absolutely love coming in to be saddled up, because they know that they're going to have lucerne hay there. They love their lucerne hay, and saddling them up, tucking them up becomes a pleasure for them, because while you're fussing over them, brushing them and doing things that they also enjoy, they've also got one of what is most horses' favourite foods in front of them to eat while you're fussing around and saddling them up. So give it a go if you don't already. Big shout out to all of you who are listening to this and go, I already do this. And I see so many of you now, and in fact, it has gotten a lot better in the last 10 years. I literally would come home from horse shows and pony club events in tears, because there would be so many horses standing around all day with no food, and I just knew what was going on inside those horses' stomachs and the pain that those poor little creatures must be in, and then still seeing them, holding it together and looking after their riders despite how they would have been feeling internally. It just breaks me to see that. So if you already do it, thank you. And please tell as many fellow horse owners to do the same. And if you can, point them in the direction of this podcast so that they can understand why, or do your best to explain. If you have to grab milk bottles and fill them up with chaff to show them, then do that. It's certainly a very effective way of demonstrating it to people. But Thank you is really all I want to say if you already do it, and please tell as many people as you can. Big thanks to you for listening right through to the end. Hey, listen, if you do have questions about feeding Lucerne before you ride, or any other question to do with horse nutrition and feeding management, go to our website, myhappy.horse, and ask Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI form. And the AI version of me is happy to answer your questions 24/7 about anything to do with feeding horses. And if you want to get your horse's diet really sorted, make sure you download My Happy Horse Virtual Nutritionist app.